The letters started arriving just 3 days after she moved in. At first, she thought it was a mistake. A warning about a mailbox that was half an inch too short. Then it was the fence. Then the flowers. Then the sound of her wind chimes. Each letter came with a fine. Each fine came with a threat. She was a single mother, recently widowed, trying to rebuild her life in what she thought was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. She'd poured every dollar she had into that small yellow house on the corner lot. It was supposed to be a fresh start, not a battlefield. But the HOA had other plans. Behind the friendly smiles at the block party and the manicured lawns were neighbors who watched everything. Who measured grass height with rulers? Who took photos of trash cans left out for too long? Who filed complaints like it was a sport? And one of them, just one, seemed unusually obsessed with her. When her son's therapy dog was suddenly deemed a nuisance animal, that was the last straw. What they didn't know was that this wasn't just any dog. And this wasn't just any woman. Because before she was a mother, before she was a widow, she served. And what the HOA was about to learn is that discipline, silence, and strategy aren't just for the battlefield. They're for survival. And now it was her turn to fight back, quietly, methodically, and legally. The question is, how far can you push someone who's already lost everything? And how much damage can a perfectly polite smile really hide? Keep watching. For Sarah Mitchell, the house on Willow Bend Lane was more than just a home. It was a promise. A quiet 3-bedroom with faded yellow siding and a wraparound porch. It sat tucked into the corner of a cul-de-sac, where kids rode scooters in packs and neighbors waved from their driveways. After a brutal 2 years, losing her husband to a sudden stroke, relocating her son Tyler to a new school, and saying goodbye to everything familiar, this house was supposed to be her fresh start. She'd found it after months of searching. Modest, affordable, and nestled in a friendly, well-maintained community, according to the brochure. The HOA fees were steep, sure, but the neighborhood was safe, the lawns were trimmed, and the crime rate was low. It felt like the right kind of quiet. Tyler, just 10, had barely spoken for months after his father's passing, but something about this new house, and more importantly their dog Scout, had started to bring him back. Scout was a retired, military K9, trained in security but gentle with children. Tyler and Scout were inseparable, and Sarah had paperwork to prove the dog's status as a certified emotional support animal. No barking, no aggression, no problems. The first few days were peaceful. Sarah unpacked boxes during the day and took long walks with Scout in the evening. Tyler started sketching again. Neighbors seemed polite, if a little reserved. A few smiled when she passed by. One woman even dropped off cookies, the kind of suburban gestures she hadn't seen in years. But then the letters started. The first was about her trash cans. They weren't stored within the regulation hours after pickup. A warning, no fine. She adjusted, no problem. The second came 2 days later. Her mailbox post was non-compliant by exactly 1.5 inches. That one came with a $75 fine and a friendly reminder to consult the HOA manual. She laughed it off, chalking it up to overzealous rule enforcement. Then came a notice about Scout. According to an anonymous complaint, her dog had been observed off-leash and appears to be of a concerning breed. The letter suggested she review HOA policies regarding animal behavior and breed restrictions. No fine this time, just a warning. That one didn't sit well. Scout had never been off-leash in public. He stuck to Sarah like a shadow. And the insinuation about his breed? Scout was a Belgian Malinois, the same kind used by law enforcement and the military. Powerful, yes. Dangerous? Not unless you were a threat. Sarah emailed the HOA politely, attaching Scout's service certification and offering to speak directly with whoever had concerns. No one responded. Instead, the next week brought a noise complaint, allegedly from Scout's barking, even though she'd installed an indoor camera that recorded every minute he was home. Not once had he barked during the hours in question. Something felt off. Sarah began noticing small things. The same silver SUV was parked just down the block, facing her house. A woman with binoculars walks her poodle past the yard, always at the same time each morning. Neighbors who once smiled now look the other way. She wasn't imagining it. The tension built slowly, like a crack forming in glass. Nothing explosive, just enough pressure to make her second-guess herself. She started reading the HOA manual more carefully and found it was filled with vague, open-ended language, rules about aesthetics, community harmony, and behavior deemed disruptive by board consensus. In other words, whatever they decided, she learned that the board president, Margaret Halbrook, had lived on Willow Bend Lane for 26 years and liked things a certain way. The house across the street had recently been repainted and then mysteriously fined for unsanctioned color palette. Another neighbor had a vintage truck towed from their own driveway for violating neighborhood image standards. Sarah had thought they were just rumors, and until she started keeping track, it wasn't about rules. It was about control. And Margaret, it seemed, didn't like things or people she couldn't control. Sarah's offense? Maybe it was the dog. Maybe it was that she didn't show up to the HOA meeting with cookies and a smile. Or maybe it was just that she didn't ask permission to exist in a world run by people who mistook authority for power. Whatever it was, she'd become a target. And Sarah knew one thing for sure. When people start weaponizing rules instead of enforcing them, someone always gets hurt. What she didn't know yet was just how far this neighborhood was willing to go. The next fine arrived taped to her front door, $150 for failure to maintain aesthetic integrity. No other explanation, no photos, no warning, just a vague citation printed in cold, bureaucratic font and a due date. Sarah stood on her porch, letter trembling in her hands, while Scout sat silently at her side. The wind was still. The street is quiet. She scanned the nearby windows, no faces, just drawn curtains and closed blinds. She was being watched. She could feel it. That week, Sarah tried to keep a low profile. She painted the mailbox post. She trimmed the hedges. She moved the trash cans inside the garage. She even bought matching planters to make her porch look more like the others on the block. But it didn't matter. The next letter was worse. A formal violation notice and a hearing. Date, the charge? Chronic non-compliance. It listed everything from minor infractions to outright lies, leash violations, landscaping inconsistencies, unapproved modifications to the front yard, which turned out to mean the solar-powered walkway, lights she'd bought at Home Depot for $19.99. The hearing was set for the following Tuesday at 7 p.m. Sarah had never been to an HOA meeting. She didn't know the procedure or the board members or whether anyone would even listen. But she printed every email, every photo, and every document about Scout. She walked in armed with evidence and quiet fury. The room was a sea of gray cardigans, folding chairs, and passive-aggressive smiles. Margaret Halbrook sat dead center. At the front of the panel, flanked by two other board members, Roger, a retired insurance agent, and Diane, who'd lived in the neighborhood since it was built. Sarah introduced herself, explained the timeline, and held up the certification proving Scout's legal status as a service animal. Margaret didn't even look up. When Sarah finished, Margaret tapped her pen against the table 3 times. Sharp, deliberate. We understand your concerns, Margaret said calmly. But the board has received multiple complaints. While we appreciate your service animal's background, we must prioritize the comfort and safety of the entire community. Sarah blinked. What safety concern? He hasn't done anything. Margaret smiled, thin and cold. It's not about what's happened. It's about what could happen. Then, with no discussion, the board moved to vote. 3 hands went up. The motion passed. Sarah was fined $500 and given 30 days to rehome Scout or face additional penalties and possible legal action under community disruption policies. She didn't sleep that night. Scout lay curled at the foot of Tyler's bed, his breathing slow, steady, unaware he was now classified as a threat. The next morning, she called an attorney. HOAs can't override federal ADA laws, he said. They're bluffing, but you'll need documentation and fast. These cases get expensive. Expensive. That word again. Sarah was already behind on utilities after the move. Tyler needed new therapy sessions. The last thing she could afford was a drawn-out legal war, especially against a board with community funds and unlimited free time. Still, she wasn't backing down. She submitted her dog's ADA and military K9 paperwork. Again. She filed an appeal. She contacted the local housing authority. She even posted in the neighborhood Facebook group, carefully, politely, asking if anyone else had received unusual fines. Within hours, the post was removed, and she was blocked from the group. That night, her mailbox was knocked over. The next morning, Tyler found Scout's service vest slashed open, stuffed behind the hedge. Sarah felt something inside her crack. She went to the police. They said it was likely a civil issue. Unless she caught someone on video, there was nothing they could do. So, she bought a camera, then 2, then 4. She installed them under the eaves, in the porch light, even in the mailbox. Days passed. No one approached the house. But the letters kept coming. Grass height violations, unauthorized lighting, aggressive pet posture. What even was that? She started noticing patterns. Violations were always issued after a specific car drove by. A silver SUV with tinted windows. It belonged to Roger, the board member. He never stopped, just drove past slowly. Then a fine would arrive 2 days later. One afternoon, while checking her cameras, Sarah caught something. At 2:37 a.m., a figure approached her driveway, paused by the porch, then quickly retreated. The footage was grainy, but clear enough to make out a dog leash in one hand and spray paint in the other. By morning, the front of her garage door was tagged with the word unfit. She called the police. This time, they took a report. But Margaret was already 1 step ahead. That same day, Sarah received a notice of nuisance behavior from the HOA, citing graffiti and defacement of community image. They blamed her for the vandalism on her own home. It was surreal, like living inside a rigged game. Still, Sarah refused to move. She reinforced the cameras. She got Scout recertified. She filed a cease and desist. And when another neighbor quietly slipped her a note, "You're not alone. They've done it to others. We're watching." She felt a flicker of something she hadn't had in weeks, hope. Then, a week before the 30-day compliance deadline, came the breaking point. Sarah came home to find animal control waiting on her porch. Someone had reported Scout for aggressive behavior and unsafe presence. The officer explained that the HOA had submitted multiple sworn statements from concerned neighbors. Sarah stood frozen as they scanned Scout's microchip, took photos, and asked if she'd be willing to voluntarily surrender the animal to avoid escalation. She almost laughed. "No," she said firmly. "You'll need a court order, and bring backup if you ever come back." The officer left, awkward and apologetic. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Sarah called her attorney again. He told her to prepare for court, but warned her it could take months. And in the meantime, the fines were adding up. The HOA had placed a lien on her property, a legal hold that could prevent her from refinancing or even selling without their approval. It was a tactic, a chokehold. They weren't trying to win a legal battle. They were trying to squeeze her until she broke. But they'd underestimated who they were dealing with. Sarah called in a favor from an old contact, a retired military police investigator who now specializes in HOA abuse cases. He agreed to help pro bono, as long as she documented everything. She already had the footage, the emails, the vandalism, the fine history, and now the animal control incident. They built a timeline, cross-referenced board meetings, neighbor, statements, security footage, and even timestamps on the complaints. And what emerged was a clear pattern of harassment and targeted retaliation. But Sarah didn't just want to win, she wanted the truth to be public. So she went to the media. Small local news outlet agreed to do a feature on HOA overreach. Sarah told her story. She shared photos of Scout, video clips of the vandalism, and printed copies of every fine. And when the story aired, 2 days later, it went viral. Suddenly, strangers from across the country were commenting, sharing, and tagging watchdog organizations. Donations started coming in through a GoFundMe her sister set up. Messages of support poured in, from veterans, single mothers, even former HOA board members who'd witnessed similar abuse. The neighborhood couldn't ignore it anymore, neither could the HOA. Margaret called an emergency board meeting and tried to push a motion to revoke Sarah's voting rights in the association, citing her public defamation and unneighborly conduct. But this time, people pushed back. Neighbors who'd stayed silent began speaking up. 3 other residents came forward with their own stories of harassment, fines for porch flags, citations for unapproved lawn gnomes, and one family who'd quietly moved away after their teenager was accused of lowering neighborhood standards. The board was no longer untouchable, and Sarah wasn't alone. But just as it seemed like momentum was on her side, a certified letter arrived in her mailbox. It wasn't from the HOA. It was from their attorney, and it stated in cold, legal language that she was being sued for defamation, breach of HOA confidentiality, and disruption of community harmony. The demand, $25,000 in damages. It was the final shot, a legal grenade thrown as their power slipped. But they'd just made one mistake too many, because Sarah still had one card left to play, and when she used it, the board wouldn't just regret harassing her. They'd regret ever underestimating her dog. Sarah stared at the letter in her hands, fingers trembling. $25,000. That's what they wanted. For defamation, emotional distress, and disruption of community harmony. The HOA was suing her in civil court, not to win but to intimidate, to bleed her dry. And it might have worked, if they hadn't made it personal. That night. She sat at her kitchen table, Scout resting at her feet, while Tyler slept soundly upstairs. The weight of the entire ordeal pressed down on her like concrete. The fines, the threats, the vandalism, the isolation, and now this lawsuit, a final desperate act of control disguised in legalese. But Sarah wasn't scared anymore. She was angry, and she wasn't fighting alone. By morning, her inbox was full. Legal volunteers, former HOA whistleblowers, media outlets requesting follow-ups. And one name stood out, Colonel Davis, her former CO, now an attorney for a military rights organization. His message was short, saw your story. I remember Scout. Let's take them apart. It was time to go on the offensive. Her legal team quickly filed a countersuit, citing harassment, unlawful intimidation, discriminatory enforcement, abuse of power, and violations of the Fair Housing Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act. They attached every letter, video, time-stamped photo, and a sworn statement from her therapist confirming Scout's medically prescribed support role. But that wasn't the bombshell. That came from a former HOA secretary, someone who'd watched the board's behavior from the inside, and finally had enough. In an affidavit, she revealed that Margaret and Roger had been targeting Sarah from the moment she moved in, calling her a security risk, unstable, and unfit for the neighborhood. Worse, they had intentionally manipulated HOA records, fabricating complaints and backdating fines to create a paper trail of false non-compliance. The final nail? Audio recordings. The secretary had secretly recorded a board meeting where, Margaret said, laughing, "Let's see how long she lasts with the dog. If she wanted peace, she should have stayed in the military." And that was it. The case that started as an anonymous nuisance complaint had just transformed into a full-blown legal scandal. 2 weeks later, in a packed county courtroom, Sarah took the stand. The HOA's attorney, a stiff man in a navy suit, tried to paint her as hostile, dramatic, and disruptive. He showed photos of Scout, questioned her parenting, and even tried to imply she was exaggerating for attention. But Sarah was calm, clear, precise. She walked the court through every fine, every violation, every silent, calculated move the HOA made, and then played the recording. The room fell silent. When the audio ended, you could hear a pin drop. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, lips tight. Then Sarah's attorney stood and asked just one question. "Ms. Mitchell, what was your job in the military?" She looked straight at the jury. "Counterintelligence." A pause. "And did your training involve identifying patterns, building evidence, and detecting covert threats?" She nodded. "Yes, that's why I knew what they were doing." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Margaret, seated at the defendant's table in a pale blue suit, refused to make eye contact. Roger looked like he wanted to vanish. But the worst, for them, came next. Sarah's attorney called the animal control officer who had visited her home weeks earlier. On the stand, he admitted under oath that he had received 3 anonymous complaints in one day, all from the same IP address, traced back to Margaret's home Wi-Fi. "Did you see any evidence of danger when you visited?" "None. The dog was calm, responsive, and fully certified." Next up was the neighbor with the silver SUV, Roger, presented with the time-stamped footage of his repeated slow drives past Sarah's home and confronted with data logs showing the exact times fines were issued shortly after. He cracked. Admitted that the board had voted privately via email to pressure her out of the neighborhood. They never expected pushback. They certainly never expected a counterattack this organized. By the end of the trial, the judge didn't need much time. The HOA's lawsuit, dismissed with prejudice, Sarah's countersuit, allowed to proceed with punitive damages. Margaret was removed from the board by unanimous community vote. Roger resigned 2 hours later. But that wasn't the moment that broke them. That came a week later, when Sarah held a community meeting on the very lawn where she'd once been fined for unaesthetic lighting. Over 50 neighbors showed up. Some came just to listen. Others came to apologize. And a few came to confess that they too had been fined unfairly, but were too afraid to speak out. Sarah didn't yell. She didn't gloat. She simply said, "This was never about rules. It was about power. But a neighborhood isn't built on fear. It's built on people." Then she turned to Tyler, who stood quietly beside her with Scout, holding a handmade sign that read, "This dog saved me. Now he saved my mom." The crowd went still. Then someone clapped, and then another, and soon the entire block was echoing with applause. But the victory wasn't just symbolic. The court awarded Sarah $68,000 in damages plus coverage of her legal fees. The lien on her property was dropped, and the HOA, now under new leadership, rewrote its bylaws to include strict limits on board authority, mandatory transparency, and protections for disabled residents. And Margaret? Her reputation was shattered. Local papers ran stories titled HOA Harassment Scandal, former president accused of targeting veteran family. Her real estate license was revoked, her board privileges banned for life, her name forever, tied to a lawsuit she thought she'd win with silence. But the biggest blow? Sarah didn't move. She stayed. She cut her lawn half an inch taller than the rules allowed. She added more solar lights. She painted her mailbox bright red. And every morning she walked Scout off-leash, fully legal, right past Margaret's former house. The same neighbors who once avoided her now waved. Some even joined her on those walks. Because it turns out all it takes is one person to stand up, to show everyone else that they can too. And Sarah? She wasn't done fighting, because across the country other neighborhoods were watching. And the stories were pouring in, letters, fines, threats, lies. So now she tells her story, loudly, and she always ends it the same way. You can bully a homeowner, you can silence a neighbor, but you never go after a soldier, especially not one with a trained K9 and nothing left to lose. The knock came just after 8 a.m. Sarah opened the door, expecting a delivery. Instead, it was a man in uniform, not police, not military, but government-issued. His badge identified him as an investigator with the Department of Housing and Urban Development. "Ms. Mitchell," he said, "we're following up on a formal civil rights complaint filed after your recent HOA dispute. Mind if we talk?" Sarah stepped aside. It turned out her story had done more than just go viral. It had triggered something bigger, a federal review of the HOA's practices, not just in her neighborhood, but across the entire HOA management company that oversaw over 200 communities statewide. What began as a petty campaign to drive her out had now opened the floodgates. More complaints poured in. Residents who had stayed quiet for years suddenly found the courage to speak out. Some had been forced to sell under threat of legal action. Others had endured repeated harassment for things as small as children's sidewalk chalk drawings, wind spinners, or having too many guests parked on their street. Sarah wasn't just a homeowner anymore. She had become a case study and a warning. The federal review led to several findings. The HOA had violated fair housing laws, particularly regarding disability discrimination and retaliation. The HOA management company had no internal checks to prevent board members from targeting residents. At least 6 other HOAs under their management were found to be in active violation of state and federal housing guidelines. As a result, the management company faced federal fines, civil lawsuits, and 2 executives were removed from their positions. Margaret Halbrook, she was subpoenaed to testify. And what she said under oath shocked even Sarah. "I didn't want her here," Margaret admitted. "She didn't fit. She brought a dog, acted like she owned the place, and didn't follow the spirit of the community. Some people just don't belong." It was the sentence that ended her public life. Her face appeared on news sites, YouTube, commentary channels, and HOA watchdog exposés. "The Iron Fist of Willow Bend," one headline read. Another simply said, "Power corrupts, even in the suburbs." But Sarah didn't celebrate. She just exhaled for the first time in nearly a year. In the weeks that followed, life changed slowly but noticeably. Tyler smiled more. His drawings, once dark, abstract, and jagged, turned vibrant again. He even started a dog blog with Scout, sharing training tips and stories. Scout the Quiet Hero, he called it. And followers poured in. The mailbox stayed red. The porch lights stayed solar. And Scout? Scout walked proudly through the neighborhood without a vest, without a leash, just Sarah's quiet command. Neighbors waved now. Some even stopped to say hi, awkwardly, as if trying to rewrite their own past silence. But Sarah didn't need their apologies. She had peace and a purpose. When her story aired again on a national morning show, she was asked, "What gave you the strength to fight?" Back when so many others just move away, she didn't hesitate. "I've lost everything before. My husband, my career, my sense of home. I won't lose my dignity. Not to a rule book written by cowards." That quote was clipped and reshared millions of times. Suddenly, Sarah was speaking. At conferences about HOA overreach, veterans' rights, and housing discrimination. She joined a nonprofit legal network helping others document their own battles. She didn't ask for attention, but it found her. And then came the most unexpected moment of all. A letter arrived. Handwritten. No return address. Inside was a folded piece of paper with a short note. "I was on the board. I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up. You reminded me that silence is complicity. Thank you." And beneath the note, a check for $2,000 made out to Sarah's legal fund. She never found out who sent it. But that wasn't the point, because for every battle fought publicly, there are 10 fought in silence. Over the next year, the HOA underwent a full restructure. New elections were held. Bylaws were rewritten, this time with input from residents. A rotating oversight committee was formed to prevent board abuse. Fines were capped, and any rule related to landscaping, decor, or animals now required clear justification and photographic evidence. A third-party mediator was brought in for disputes. Residents could now appeal violations without fear of retaliation. Anonymous complaints no longer accepted. And best of all, the community passed something called the Scout Clause, a rule explicitly protecting certified service and support animals from harassment, discrimination, or forced removal under any condition not backed by state or federal law. The clause was named in honor of the dog who never bit, never barked, but never backed down. Scout became a local legend. But beyond the neighborhood, the ripples spread farther than Sarah ever imagined. One of the videos about her story caught the attention of a state representative who introduced legislation aimed at reforming HOA governance. The proposed bill, called the Mitchell Act, would mandate board member training on federal housing law, require public documentation of all fines and violations, give homeowners a 30-day grace period for non-emergency citations, ban personal retaliation by board members. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about protecting people from being harassed in the very homes they pay for, live in, and raise families in. It was about forcing transparency in systems that operate in the shadows, and it was about proving that ordinary people, even those without money, political power, or social capital, can stand up to bullies with clipboards and realize they've always had more power than they were led to believe. Months after the dust had settled, Sarah stood on her porch with a cup of coffee, watching Tyler play fetch with Scout in the front yard. The sun was just rising, casting long shadows across the driveway. She thought about everything they'd been through. The silence, the fear. The first time, she wondered if she'd made a mistake moving here, and how close she came to walking away. But she stayed. She endured. And now, standing there, with no threats in the mailbox, No fines taped to her door, no eyes watching from behind curtains. She felt it for the first time in what felt like years. Home. Real, undeniable home. Not just a place, but a space she claimed, defended, and made better, not just for her and her son, but for everyone else who might find themselves in the same battle. And she knew. There would always be another Margaret somewhere, another board hiding behind the bylaws, another neighbor who confuses control with community. But now more people were ready to fight back, because they'd seen her story. They knew it could be done. And somewhere out there, someone was watching her video right now, staring at their own violation letter, wondering if they had the strength to fight. And they do. Because Sarah did. Final. Takeaway. Call to engagement. So, the next time someone tells you to just follow the rules, ask who made those rules and who they're meant to protect. Because rules without empathy are just weapons in the wrong hands. And sometimes the quietest neighbor is the one with the sharpest instincts, the strongest spine, and a military-trained dog who never misses a signal.